On a bitter November morning, the county largest corporate farm was exactly 24 hours away from losing a $2 million sugar beet harvest. The ground had turned into a frozen slab of concrete overnight, and a fleet of computerized harvesting machines worth millions of dollars sat completely paralyzed in the mud. The sensors flashed warning lights, the hydraulic systems failed, and the highly paid engineers stood around in the freezing wind with absolutely no idea what to do. Their entire season was rotting beneath the ice. But the solution to their massive crisis was not going to come from a factory or a computer chip. It was going to come from a quiet old man named Silas, a rusty piece of junk he bought for $45, and a brutal mechanical truth that no modern engineer wanted to admit. Let me tell you exactly how a piece of welded scrap iron humiliated the most arrogant corporate farming operation in the state and saved a harvest that everyone else said was lost forever. Let me tell you about Silas, because you need to understand the man before you can understand the absolute humiliation he handed to the corporate engineers next door. Silas was a quiet man who farmed a modest 200 acres of decent ground he inherited from his father. He was not the kind of man who bought shiny new equipment or took out massive loans to impress the neighbors. He believed in debt-free farming, and he believed in old iron. His machines were heavy, loud, and purely mechanical. They lacked computers and climate control, but they possessed something modern machines did not, which was a stubborn refusal to quit. Just a week before the freezing weather hit, Silas had visited a local scrapyard and found a rusted, bent plow frame buried under a pile of discarded sheet metal. The scrap dealer practically gave it away for $45, thinking Silas was crazy for wanting it. But Silas saw the heavy gauge steel hidden beneath the rust. He hauled the heavy iron back to his barn, fired up his welding torch, and spent 3 days heating, bending, and fusing the metal back into its original shape. He reinforced the stress points with thick steel plates, creating a crude but indestructible mechanical beast. It was ugly, but it was built for pure, unadulterated torque. Right across the fence line from Silas sat a massive corporate farming operation managed by a man named Vance. Vance was not a farmer, he was a businessman who wore clean boots and believed that technology could outsmart nature every single time. That season, Vance had convinced his corporate board to invest millions in a fleet of brand new computer-controlled harvesters. These machines were engineering marvels packed with hydraulic sensors, automated depth control, and delicate computerized load limiters designed to protect the equipment from damage. Vance loved to parade these massive green machines near the fence line, showing off his multi-million-dollar fleet to anyone who would watch. The problem began when the local weather forecast predicted an unusually early and brutal hard freeze. Silas knew what that meant for the heavy clay soil in the valley. It meant the muddy fields were going to freeze solid, turning the ground into impenetrable rock. He walked over to the corporate property line where Vance and a team of factory engineers were inspecting their shiny new harvesters. Silas politely warned them about the incoming freeze. He suggested they bring in some heavy mechanical ripper plows to break the soil open before the temperature dropped, because their delicate computerized harvesters would never penetrate the frozen clay. Vance looked at Silas and then looked over the fence at the ugly, rusted $45 plow sitting in Silas' yard. Vance laughed out loud, and the factory engineers joined in. They mocked the old man and his scrap metal creation. Vance told Silas that his new machines had advanced hydraulic sensors that could calculate soil density in milliseconds. He proudly declared that modern engineering did not need advice from a man driving a rusted relic from the past. He told Silas to head back to his scrapyard and let the real professionals handle the harvest with advanced technology. Silas did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded, turned around, and walked back to his barn, leaving the arrogant manager and his engineers to their misplaced confidence. He knew the freeze was coming, and he knew exactly what ice did to delicate sensors. That night, the temperature dropped faster than anyone in the valley had ever seen. The bitter wind swept across the open fields, carrying a deep, unnatural cold that penetrated the waterlogged soil. What had been a vast expanse of soft, muddy ground slowly began to harden. By 3 in the morning, the clay and water had fused together, turning the entire 100-acre field into a solid block of frozen concrete. The sugar beet crop, worth an estimated $2 million, was now trapped beneath a layer of impenetrable ice and hardened earth. When the sun came up, Vance stood at the edge of the field with his steaming cup of coffee, feeling completely confident. He gave the signal, and his multi-million-dollar fleet of computerized harvesters roared to life. The massive green machines rolled forward, with their climate-controlled cabs and digital displays glowing in the morning light. They looked completely unstoppable, right up until the moment their heavy steel harvesting blades made contact with the frozen ground. This is where the reality of modern engineering collided with the brutal force of nature. As the first harvester tried to push its blades into the earth, a sudden violent shudder ran through the entire machine. The ground was simply too hard. Instantly, the advanced hydraulic sensors detected the extreme resistance. The onboard computers, which were designed to prevent mechanical damage, immediately flashed red warning lights across the dashboard screens. Before the operator could even react, the computerized load limiters triggered a fail-safe protocol. The engine power was automatically cut and the hydraulic pressure was released. The massive machine just stopped, dead in its tracks. Vance watched in horror as the exact same thing happened to the second harvester and then the third. The operators tried to manually override the systems, but the computers refused to cooperate. They were programmed to protect the expensive hydraulic pumps from overloading, and the frozen clay was registering as an immovable object. When the operators tried to force the machines forward, the massive rubber tires simply spun uselessly across the slick, icy surface, finding absolutely no traction. The entire fleet of state-of-the-art harvesting equipment was completely paralyzed. The machines were too smart to break themselves, so they simply refused to work at all. Panic began to spread among the corporate engineers. They were on a strict timeline. If the sugar beets stayed in the frozen ground too long, the cell walls of the crop would rupture, and the entire $2 million harvest would turn into worthless, rotting mush as soon as the weather warmed up. They had exactly 24 hours to get the crop out of the ground. Vance grabbed his radio and frantically called the regional equipment dispatch, asking for heavier machinery or specialized ice rippers. But the dispatch center gave him the worst possible news. Every other corporate farm in the region was facing the exact same sudden freeze, and every available piece of heavy equipment was already deployed. There was no rescue coming. The arrogance that Vance had displayed just 24 hours earlier completely evaporated. He stood in the freezing wind, staring at a fortune in rotting crops and a fortune in useless machinery. His engineers scrambled around with their tablets and technical manuals, desperately trying to reprogram the harvesters to bypass the safety limits. But the factory-engineered systems were locked down tight. The technology that was supposed to make them invincible had become their absolute downfall. The valley was silent, except for the sound of the freezing wind and the frustrated yelling of men who had suddenly realized that nature did not care about their expensive computers. The freezing wind was howling across the paralyzed operation of corporate farming when a new sound broke through the valley. It was not the high-pitched whine of a modern computerized starter or the polite beep of a digital warning sensor. It was the deep, rhythmic thud of an old diesel engine. Vance and his entire team of highly paid engineers turned their heads toward the fence line. Rolling out from the modest property next door was Silas, sitting on the open seat of his decades-old tractor. Trailing behind him, clanking against the frozen ruts, was the exact same piece of welded scrap metal they had all laughed at yesterday, the $45 junkyard plow. Silas drove his machine right past the fleet of stuck multi-million-dollar harvesters. He did not wave to the engineers. He did not stop to lecture Vance about ignoring his warning. He simply steered his heavy mechanical beast to the very edge of the frozen sugar beet field where the ice and clay were the thickest. The corporate crew stopped scrambling with their useless tablets and gathered around to watch. Some of the younger engineers still had smirks on their faces, fully expecting the old iron to shatter into 100 pieces the moment it touched the frozen concrete of the field. Silas reached down and engaged the mechanical levers. There were no touch screens to navigate and no delicate buttons to push. He just grabbed the heavy steel handle and forced the plow downward. The heavy-gauge steel blade, which Silas had spent 3 days heating and bending back into shape, hit the frozen earth with a heavy thud. Now, you need to understand the fundamental difference between what Vance brought to that field and what Silas brought. The corporate harvesters were designed with brilliant engineering meant to preserve the expensive equipment. If the ground was too hard, the computers told the hydraulics to back off. They were smart machines. Silas was driving a completely dumb machine. His tractor did not know that the ground was frozen solid. The welded scrap plow did not have a microchip to measure the extreme density of the ice. The entire setup only knew one single command, which was to move forward and pull until the job was done or until the metal tore itself apart. And Silas had reinforced those welds with his own 2 hands, knowing exactly how much punishment they could take. Silas eased out the clutch. The old diesel engine lugged down hard, the RPMs dropping as the massive rear tires bit into the slick surface. A thick plume of black smoke erupted from the exhaust stack. The tractor groaned, pulling against the anchored weight of the frozen plow. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing moved. The engineers held their breath, waiting for the inevitable snap of breaking metal. But the weld held. The heavy-gauge steel frame of the junkyard plow took the unimaginable stress and transferred it straight into the earth. Suddenly, a sound like a rifle shot echoed across the field. It was not the plow breaking. It was the frozen earth shattering. The blade dug under the crust and ripped a massive, jagged trench through the ice. Silas pushed the throttle wide open. The old tractor roared with absolute fury and dragged the $45 scrap plow straight through the impenetrable clay. Giant chunks of frozen mud and ice were thrown aside, exposing the perfectly preserved sugar beets beneath. The smirk completely vanished from the faces of the corporate engineers. They watched in absolute stunned silence as Silas reached the end of the row, turned his machine around, and began ripping another perfect line through the ice. The machine that was supposedly headed for the scrap heap was violently tearing apart the frozen barrier that had defeated millions of dollars of advanced technology. There were no warning lights flashing. There were no safety sensors shutting the engine down. There was just raw, unfiltered torque and the stubborn will of an old farmer who refused to let a little bit of ice ruin a harvest. Vance stood shivering in his expensive coat, completely speechless. He was watching his $2 million crop being saved by a man he had insulted and a piece of junk he had told to throw away. Silas just kept driving, tearing open the earth row by row, leaving a trail of shattered ice and bruised egos in his wake. For hours, the only sound in the valley was the deep rhythmic barking of Silas and his old diesel engine. He drove with a steady, relentless precision that only comes from decades of knowing exactly what a machine can handle. Every time he reached the end of a row, he turned the heavy steering wheel with his calloused hands, lowered the welded scrap iron back into the frozen mud, and let the sheer mechanical torque do what millions of dollars of computerized engineering could not. The $45 plow did not bend. The heavy steel welds that Silas had painstakingly laid down in his drafty barn held together against the impossible stress of the frozen clay. It was a brutal and violent process. Giant slabs of frozen earth were thrown to the side, shattering into pieces and exposing the sugar beets that had been trapped underneath the ice. Vance and his team of highly educated factory engineers did not leave the edge of the field. They stood in the bitter, biting wind with their hands shoved deep into their expensive coats, watching the absolute destruction of their own arrogance. Just 24 hours earlier, they had laughed out loud at the old man. They had mocked his rusted tractor and told him to take his junk back to the scrapyard so the real professionals could work. Now those same professionals were forced to stand in silence and watch. Their fleet of shiny green harvesters still sat paralyzed in the mud, their advanced computer screens completely dark and their delicate hydraulic pumps locked in safety mode. They were perfectly preserved monuments to modern failure. As Silas ripped through the 50th row, the reality of the situation began to settle heavily onto Vance. His entire career was hanging by a thread, and that thread was being pulled by a man he had deeply insulted. If Silas had chosen to stay home that morning, the $2 million corporate harvest would have been a total catastrophic loss. The beets would have rotted the moment the ground thawed, and Vance would have been fired by the corporate board before the end of the week. But Silas had not stayed home. He had fired up his obsolete tractor and crossed the property line simply because a harvest was in danger, and a true farmer never lets a harvest die if he can help it. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, cold shadows across the shattered ice of the field. Silas did not stop to eat. He did not stop to stretch his aching back. The old tractor burned steadily through its tank of cheap diesel, lugging down hard in the thickest spots of the swamp, but never once stalling. Row after row, the frozen barrier was torn open, clearing a perfect path for the manual harvest crews to safely extract the crop. By late afternoon, the entire 100-acre field had been ripped wide open. The sugar beets were safe. The massive $2 million investment was entirely saved. Silas reached the final row, pulled the heavy mechanical lever to raise his battered $45 plow out of the dirt, and turned his machine around to face the corporate crew. He pulled the throttle back and let the hot engine idle. The sudden quiet across the field was deafening. The engineers, who had spent years studying advanced hydraulics and computerized load limiters, looked down at their boots, unable to meet the old man directly in the eyes. There were no smirks left on their faces. There was no laughter echoing across the property line. There was only the profound, crushing humiliation of knowing that their expensive degrees and their state-of-the-art technology had just been completely outclassed by a quiet farmer with a welding torch and a discarded piece of scrap. Metal.
Vance walked across the shattered ice holding a company checkbook. He offered to buy the welded plow for a ridiculous sum or at least pay Silas for saving his entire career. Silas did not take the money. He simply looked at the corporate manager and told him that metal only has true value when it sits in the hands of a man who actually knows how to use it. With that, Silas engaged the clutch of his old diesel tractor and drove back across the property line, leaving the engineers with a lesson they would never forget. Let me pause here and share something important about what happened in that frozen field. The modern world constantly tells us that computers and delicate sensors are the ultimate answer to every problem. But there is a fundamental difference between new technology and old tradition. Modern machines are engineered to protect themselves when the conditions get difficult. They automatically shut down to prevent their own destruction. Old iron was built with a completely different philosophy. Those machines were designed to complete the task no matter the cost. Sometimes a discarded piece of scrap metal combined with the stubborn willpower of a traditional farmer will beat $1 million computer every single time. The story of Silas and his scrap plow is a carefully crafted fiction inspired by the countless real and undocumented struggles of rural American farmers who have used their mechanical genius to survive impossible odds. These are the forgotten legends of agricultural history that we strive to honor here. If you appreciate the enduring legacy of American farming and the raw power of old iron, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your own stories of vintage machinery outworking modern technology down in the comments because every acre has a story and we want to hear yours.